to ask you panelists, how is the world any different for a journalist of colour in the UK today than it was 18 months ago? I mean, what can we, hand on heart, say has changed?
I think from my perspective, there was this realization that something which happened 5,000 odd miles away can have an impact across the globe. That's the first thing I think journalists realized. But Ian, unfortunately, we've been here before. Rodney King in the 1990s, Stephen Lawrence, all the stuff that has been there, it will always be there. And I think that we're again at this cyclical point where peaks and troughs, we're at that peak, and we'll slowly get down to a trough where things will change for a little while, and then it'll revert back to normal. And that's my biggest fear. What changes have I seen? I've seen certainly this awakening that we need to cover Black and Asian and diverse stories a lot more. And we've certainly seen that. And I know you're going to ask questions about our own personal experiences, but I think that we're at a point where we can either make it and break the cycle once and for all, or we continue as business as usual.
Nazia, do you agree with Barnie that if we're not careful, this could just be, you know, just part of that continual cycle of a little bit of it?
I don't know. I'm hoping this is a moment where we break that cycle. Actually, I don't know. This felt really big, like huge, and it wasn't just in journalism. I think every single industry, it's allowed them to sort of shine a light up to their practices and their policies and their recruitment. And I don't know, I think this is a very definite point of change. I think you asked this earlier in terms of how how it had changed for us as reporters. I mean, for me, my whole complete job changed. So The Guardian created, as a result of what happened with George, they created 2 new community affairs correspondents, and our remit is to focus on underrepresented communities. So we, as an organisation, definitely have committed to this, and there's been a definite shift in our focus in order to make sure that certain communities are being given a voice.
Yes, thank you, Nazia. Lucile, Jasmine, I mean, does it feel different to you? I mean, and the organisations you work for. I mean, obviously, that they will have made bold statements, but from what you've seen so far, because I know both of you are relatively new to your organisations, does it feel that they are, this is something that they're taking seriously?
Yes, definitely. And I think now there's really nowhere for organisation to hide. There is expectation from audiences and people in our duty to reflect the audiences that we serve. There is this accountability. I think also an increased understanding that our journalists are being affected by the news. We're working with humans, and what's our responsibility as organisations to take into consideration that when something as traumatic as the murder of George Floyd happened, what's the impact on mental health on top of having our employees working in a pandemic? And I think that's been a real shift, is how do we help our journalists to do the best work by looking after them, after their mental health and their well-being, understanding that it's everyone's responsibility to report on race and racism, that not only our journalists from an ethnic minority background.
Thank you, Lucile. Jasmine, are you optimistic about how things have changed in the last 18 months?
First of all, can you hear me okay? There's a lot of background noise. Okay, perfect. I'm cautiously optimistic. One shift I have noticed on a personal level is other journalists asking me, what does it feel like to be a Black journalist in the newsroom? And I'd never been asked that before George Floyd. And I think there's more of a conscious acknowledgement that if you're a Black journalist in the newsroom, your experience is going to be different, and you're going to be impacted by, like the Meghan Markle story, for example. You're going to navigate that story in a slightly different way. And I think one thing I certainly have noticed is that I've been a full-time journalist since 2017. And I often felt that whenever I pitched stories about race, there was often a sort of, is it newsworthy? Is this actually a story? And then post, the Black Lives Matter protests and George Floyd, there's a sense that actually stories about race aren't just, stories that you cover once in a while. These are actually really important stories that can lead the news agenda. And so there's been a shift to seeing race as a topic, as maybe, a side story or not real journalism, to actually realizing that actually this is a big topic that organizations have to feel confident in tackling.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I mean, that takes me on to what I want to ask next, really, which is about the content of what our news organizations are producing, broadcasting, publishing. I mean, how has that changed? I mean, Jasmine, explained there just the obviously the increased appetite for stories that enable our listeners, our viewers, our readers to get a sense of what is happening in our communities post George Floyd. But what kind of stories are we seeing that we didn't see perhaps 18 months ago? And also, how are our news organizations actually doing that reporting in a different way? Or are they bringing different perspectives, or is it really just about filling our pages with a quota of stories about communities? What do we feel about that? Who wants to kick off on that one?
I think I'm going to be the curmudgeon guy in this, who's going to bring the atmosphere down. So forgive me, because I've just been around for 40 years and I've seen this happen so often, and I've been taken to the edge of nirvana only to have it come crushing down. So forgive me if there's a level of skepticism here.
Oh no, we need that voice in the room, Barney. Thank you.
So when I started in 1981, I'd walk into a newsroom and I'd be the only person of colour in that room. And I've been in some newsrooms where the whole place had just gone silent, and you could see the tumbleweed roll across the newsroom. And I think it's a point that Jasmine and Nazia both made, that there is this currency at the moment about race stories. I think the last 12 months for me have been a mixture of pride, depression and frustration. Pride that the Asian media group for whom I work, are the publishers of Eastern Eye, continues with a legacy of really digging into the stories that affect the South Asian communities. So we were the first to uncover the pandemic effect on the South Asian and Black communities, and published it way before anybody else at the beginning and the end of March. We sort of campaign all the time. So our specialism is there. But one thing I've never forgotten is that there are people who've gone before me who have allowed that to happen. It's been 60 years since Mahendra Kaul and Salim Shahid did a program called New Beginnings, New Life on the BBC, and it's in their footsteps that I follow. And I never forget that. I'm depressed because we still have people of colour thinking that taking the knee is jester politics. And I'm frustrated that our industry won't take creative risks, and that it continues to do the same things over and over again with all the different initiatives and expect different results. So yeah, I think this is an opportunity, as Nazia and Jasmine have both said, and Lucile have said. But I've been there, and I'm just waiting to see what happens in the next 12 months, in the next 24 months, in the next 36 months, and the next generation who are coming up. Because at this moment, I can only think of one person in the whole of the broadcast and media industry who has his hands on the lever of power, and that one person just can't manage that change alone.
Okay, well, thank you, Barney.
All the temperature down.
No. I think that's called realism, I guess. I mean, Nazia, Jasmine, when you're in the news meetings every morning, I mean, are you seeing different stories? You've already hinted at being able to pitch stories that you couldn't have pitched before, but are you also seeing a difference in the way that, or the freedoms that you are being given, or the respect you're being given for your ideas? Or explain maybe how those editorial decisions may be different than they would have been 12 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand what Barney's saying, and I've been doing this job for sort of 16 years, almost 16 years, and there is an element where you sometimes feel, am I just the flavour of the month? Like, is this just the hot topic for now, and then they'll move on? But like I was saying before, it feels too much of a sea change for me, definitely. That so when I pitch stories, yes, that very thing, Ian, where there is an added level of respect, and your opinion is very valid as a journalist of colour, and you are being asked to sort of write a particular piece because they know that your background will inform that piece in a particular way. And like Barney, I did, we all probably have, but I did a lot of work on the BAME community being disproportionately affected by COVID. And the amount of support I got, and the amount of space I got in the paper for the pieces that I wrote was just incredible. And we were able to really portray, what was going on in these communities. And I just do not think that would have happened pre-George Floyd.
Have you had a chance to speak to colleagues in other newspapers? I mean, is it industry-wide, this increased respect, do you think, or is it still pretty patchy?
I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, I do work for an organisation which is more likely to cover race stories, and Jasmine and Lucile might have a different take on this. But I don't get everything commissioned that I pitch in terms of race stories still. So it's not like a free-for-all. There's still a bit of pushback on certain things. But yeah, I guess The Guardian is an organisation that is more likely to print stories on race. I guess that's just the nature of the beast.
And sorry, just one final question before I ask the same question of Jasmine. But I mean, is there a sense though that there's still a pigeonholing of race-related stories in a certain part of the paper, or they're written in a certain way, and then the rest of the content of the newspaper is unaffected? I mean, does it feel that actually content across the whole of the newspaper and the website is now informed by what we've learned and we've understood and our reporting of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just we don't have a particular page a day devoted to race stories, and that's we're going to bung all of them together, and we've done our bit for race relations. There's been a change across our editorial reporting, whether that's health or education, or Langray, who's our culture reporter, and that's white staff and journalists of colour. Everyone has had, so I don't know who used the word awakening, but everybody has you know, just sort of looking at this and thinking, right, there's something not quite right here. You know, why is this person being treated like this? Whether that's in education or health or, you know, crime stories. So it's not just me and Amna, who are the two community affairs correspondents doing race stories. It's happening across the editorial team.
Thank you, Nazia. Similar picture at the FT, Jasmine, or is it slightly different?
I mean, it's slightly different in the sense that the FT is obviously a financial paper, and so it's going to be interested in how racism manifests in the city, for example, or in the NHS. So it's always going to have a slightly different angle. And I do think it's important, that point you raised about, you know, the media as a whole, it isn't uniform. So how the Mirror or the Daily Mail want to report on race is going to be different to how the FT and the Guardian do it. And so I think what I've noticed is there's inconsistencies with how well organizations can actually tell this, you know, the stories when it comes to race. And one thing I would definitely echo is this idea that there has been a greater acknowledgement, I found, that if you are, say, a Black reporter, you might be able to add something different to a story, say about why elderly Black individuals in London are hesitant to take the vaccine. And I think there has been something quite distinct about this pandemic, where we've seen, I think we've got slightly better at reporting about how racism manifests in specific areas. If we look at the area of health, for example, because there was a pandemic, there have been two key issues. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, we saw that ethnic minorities were most likely to be infected with COVID. And then towards the end of the pandemic, we've seen that ethnic minorities are more likely to be slightly more hesitant. And so we've sort of moved into more in-depth reporting, because you need in-depth reporting to tell those stories properly. And it's not just a case of questioning, you know, does racism exist? There's been an acknowledgement of these are the disparities that exist, and we have to investigate why. So I think we have got better in that area, but I would also caveat that by saying that these issues, when it comes to health disparities, sorry, that was a motorcycle, health disparities in COVID have often been driven by ethnic minority reporters. That's not been the organisation taking initiative. It's been ethnic minority reporters who have seen an issue and kept digging, and then other news organisations have had to follow.
So I guess you know, it's these two perfect storms almost coming together of COVID and George Floyd that have created, bizarrely, you know, these opportunities that probably wouldn't have been there 18 months ago. Would we agree with that? That we simply wouldn't be having this same conversation without those two events? Or do we think we were already on a trajectory that would have got us there eventually?
I think that from my perspective, it's really a matter of timing. I think we've taken an opportunity here. Over the last decade, and I've been sort of looking at it from an academic perspective, we have seen a greater willingness to understand that diversity in all its forms, and especially creative diversity, is what creates great journalism. It's what creates great business. And the diversity of thought, the diversity of willing to discuss, is what creates that space to draw in readers. And the bottom line is business. And so it's always been about the business. And so there has been a trajectory, and if anything, the past 18 months with George Floyd and the pandemic have provided a catalyst. Now, we've got to pay homage to some of the other papers as well. Look, someone's misfortune is another person's gain. If we look at what's happened at the Huffington Post, they've closed down their UK department, but Jess Brammer, absolutely talent spotted. She nurtured and made sure that her team was ready to move elsewhere. And that's why somebody as great as Nadine White, as great as Asmodee, are now working for the Eye. And I don't know whether it's because the Guardian did this first, but the creation of a race correspondent, that the Independent did. I'm hoping the Times might do it, and other newspapers might do it. It is a great opportunity, and that's what we've got to hold on to. I think the fact is there is an opportunity there. If we don't grab it with both hands, as Nazia and Jasmine and Lucile have pointed out, then it's our loss. This is a moment, And it's about grabbing that with both hands and shaking it and not letting go, and making sure that we're like limpets, just holding on for dear life and making sure that it isn't a one-off thing. And I think that it is an opportunity that some people have suddenly got.
That's actually really interesting, because with any aspects of diversity and inclusion, let alone race and ethnicity, you can't afford to take your eye off the ball. It has to be front and center of everything that you do, and really be embedded as part of the reporting process. But I think something that's also been interesting is reviewing what sort of stories are being discussed, and reframing that it doesn't have to be always about the challenges. And of course, it's, you know, how ethnic minorities, for example, have been disproportionately affected by COVID is a very important topic, but also looking at how are the communities getting together, what are the positive stories, how can you bring out those stories that without the work of journalists from ethnic minorities you wouldn't get to really change, reframe the dialogue, reframe the perceptions that audiences might not have. And I think that's really interesting aspect and an opportunity as well to for us to grab.
And if I could just follow up, Lucile, when we've talked about content and the importance of changing the narrative and pitching different types of stories, but in terms of getting people in post and retaining them and then promoting them, which is, I think, maybe what Barney's referring to as well, in terms of just nurturing talent, so that, you know, we have the right people in the right positions to do this reporting. I mean, what can news organizations do better on that front? Again, you know, we know we've had diversity fellowships and internships and scholarships before, but, you know, it's clear that at the top of our news organizations, we're still failing, aren't we? So how can news organizations accelerate that progress? Because we know the talent is there, but for some reason it's just not getting through quick enough and rising through the ranks enough. So what can news organizations do, Lucile, do you think?
And I think, again, the interesting thing when we discuss diversity and inclusion is it's two sides of the same coin. And you can attract the talent, bring the talent in, but if your culture is not conducive to talent from ethnic minority backgrounds or diverse backgrounds to grow and feel like they can pitch stories, that there will be values, that there is a psychological safety, people are going to leave. And I think it is really for organizations to recognize that there is the data that you need to look into. You need to rely on quantitative data, the numbers, the stats, the targets, but also the qualitative data. What are your employees telling you? Do you have, as an organization, a zero tolerance approach on racism and all forms of discrimination? Do your employees believe that it's a process that's going to work? And I think now what organizations really need to focus on is really growing internal talent, looking at opportunities to act up or gain skills or expertise or shadow and reverse mentor, and really look strategically at the career progression of talent from diverse backgrounds.
I mean, thank you, Lucile. Some really good points there. I mean, Nazia, does that sound like the sort of practice that is in news organizations already, or does that sound like something that needs to be built? I mean, what's been your experience to date of career progression for journalists of color? Does it look different? Is it different for journalists of color as opposed to others?
So I definitely think that a lot more work needs to be done in this area. There is even at The Guardian, there's a distinct lack of journalists of colour in senior leadership positions, and that's and that's a real shame, like real shame, because people do end up leaving the industry because they, there's barriers, and they just feel like they can't progress. And also when you're being commissioned to do a story, sometimes, especially if it's a race-related story or about a particular minority community, it's good to be commissioned by someone who is also a news editor of colour. But they are few and far between, and also in our senior leadership team in other departments like advertising and technology, there's still a real distinct lack of people of colour in senior positions. So there is absolutely a need for that to change. We are within the Guardian, as journalists, we have started a Guardian and Observer reporters of colour group, and we are pushing for change. How long that will take, I don't know, but we're sort of at the start of this kind of what will be, I think, quite a long battle to get more journalists into positions where they are managers and overseeing staff, and it's not just white journalists who become news editors and go on to become editors.
And I know there's not going to be any magic bullet here, Nazia, but I mean, are there any easy wins that you can say to management? Look, just by doing this simple thing, that could actually make a big difference. I mean, I don't know if has your group identified anything that in particular that you're sort of focusing on to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things which was really easy to do is that I think there's a culture of this in lots of newspapers where jobs weren't being advertised, for example, and people were just being sort of tapped on the shoulder and appointed, and inevitably the person that was getting a tap on the shoulder was white. So one of the things that we have we've sort of demanded really is for all positions to be advertised, so that gives an opportunity for minority staff to apply for those jobs. And that was a really easy fix, and happened not instantly. It still took a few months, but now all jobs are being advertised openly and everybody can go for them. So it's like a fair playing field. Another thing that we have suggested is a lot of the time I find, and I'm counting myself in this, journalists of colour are sometimes not as confident, especially when they first start out. And I think it's good for them, and I wish I had one, for them to have a mentor. And that's another thing which is really easy to do, just to sort of team them up with a senior journalist who can sort of basically, help them in how they pitch and, to speak the lingo of journalism and how to get, navigate a news editor and send them an email and things like that, which you think would be really easy, but sometimes it just doesn't come as easy to journalists of colour.
Thank you, Nazia. Barnie, you wanted to add something there?
I think there are dead easy, pragmatic things we can do. Ahead of this conversation, you asked us what we need to do, and I came up with 7 ideas off the top of my head, which I won't go into right now, but hopefully we'll have time to expand at the end. But look, we've been here. We've had the mentoring and the development programs. We've had them forever. The thing that everybody's missing out is championing. How did white people get the tap on the shoulder? It's because somebody championed them. They dragged them over the line. And until people get that, nothing's going to change. And it really does. It really isn't rocket science here. You've got to put people in front of people, and you've got to give them a chance. And here's the thing that you've got to be allowed to do, and that's fail. If we're not allowed to fail creatively, we're not going to learn anything for a start. We're always going to be thought of as the brown or black person that's failed because they're brown or black. If a white man fails, it's because he's had a bad day at the office. If a black or brown person fails, it's because, or if you're a woman and you fail, it's because you're a woman that you failed. Or it's because you're black or brown that you failed, not because of the fact that you've had a bad day or somebody didn't help you or you were set up to fail in the first place. That's what industries don't get. And all the while we talk about policies and tick box exercises, and forgive me, Lucile, reverse mentoring. No, championing. That's what we need. We need champions who are, as I've been doing for the whole of my life, is dragging people into meetings and saying, this guy, this woman is absolutely brilliant. This working class kid who hasn't got a degree is better than I am at writing, better than I am at finding stories. Help him or her out, give him a 3-month contract, see what you can do about it. But you've got 3 levels. You've got the beginners, you've got the middle, and you've got the top. It's the gatekeepers in the middle that's stopping everything because they're too scared of their own jobs. They don't want to fail because they're going to get the sack. They're going to recruit in their own image. And that's the big problem in this industry that nobody ever talks about.
I mean, the chat box is coming alive, Barney, with people applauding you for your comments. And I don't think anybody disagrees that championing is what needs. I suppose, to correct me if I'm wrong, but the difficulty is, how do you systemize championing? How do you make sure that it's happening, you know, other than just hoping and relying on those senior leaders to have, I guess, the...
Marvin Rees, who's the mayor of Bristol, an ex-BBC colleague of mine, says, look at those leaders, not managers. You manage processes, you lead people. Look at those leaders who have created a diverse workforce in their own teams. What are they doing right? Applaud them, learn from them. At the same time, learn from your mistakes too. We're going to make mistakes, we're human. We're going to use the N word, the P word, when we shouldn't. That's small fry compared to the fact there's systemic, institutional and structural racism, and unwitting or wittingly so. It's the people within the organizations that have to create that environment and take those risks. It can be systemic, it can be systematic. The thing is that you take a punt on somebody, you take risks. It'll work sometimes it won't, but you're going to learn something from it. And we're going to be a better organization for it.
Okay, Barney, thank you. And I will come back for your 7 top tips. Don't worry, we're going to get a chance to hear those. Jasmine, before we move on, I mean, from what Nazia was telling us about The Guardian, are you seeing similar issues and similar progress in terms of, and actually, you know, in terms of your experience, because, you know, at the Echo and the Telegraph, I mean, yeah, what gaps are you seeing still in terms of bringing the right people in, nurturing them, progressing them through the organization, being championed, as Barney discussed? I mean, what gaps are you seeing still, Jasmine?
I mean, my experience in newsrooms is that there's, you know, the ethnic minority journalists are consistently the ones who are junior, the ones on freelance contracts, short-term contracts, and then as you progress up the organisation, it tends to be, you know, whiter, more male, you know, people who are privately educated. And I've heard many stories of ethnic minority journalists really feeling sidelined and alienated in newsrooms. And I think, just touching upon what Barney says, I think it really, in order to change that pattern of journalists feeling marginalised, there needs to be sort of concerted, proactive attempts. So when I joined the FT, for example, one of the first things they did is they gave me a mentor, but often beyond that, it's getting a sponsor as well, somebody that's going to say your name in meetings when you're not there. Oh, there's an opportunity. Oh, what about Jasmine? Oh, you know, talking about your piece when you're not in the room. And I think that's important. And I think so many, you know, a lot of relationships in the newsroom are informal, and they're often built up by, you know, a senior editor sees a young journalist and thinks, oh, I went to their school, or I went to their Oxford college. And so you feel that sense of familiarity. And so you want to invest in them. And it's about those at the top realizing that, you know, it's important to invest in those that don't look like you or don't sound like you or haven't come from your background. And even if, you know, that comes from management saying, we're going to set up a formal sponsorship program and this is how we're doing it, even if that's what needs to happen on a formal basis, if not an informal basis, stuff like that can make a difference. Because I think, I mentioned I was cautiously optimistic. Whilst there's been a lot of, you know, positive talk, I think the reality in newsrooms is that, you know, a lot of people are getting sidelined and people aren't getting supported. And I definitely reiterate what Barney was saying about people being allowed to fail. So I was talking to a colleague the other day, and he was talking about someone very, very senior who, when they first started, could barely write, could barely string a sentence together. And yet they were given the investment to become a better journalist. And often Black and brown journalists their careers aren't invested in as much. So maybe you start good and, you know, you're allowed to progress and you're seen as a star. But if you're Black and ethnic minority journalist who, you know, maybe you're a bit rough around the edges and you just need a bit more support, you don't get it. And I think it's about that, making sure people have the support, making sure that, you know, people are mentoring you, sponsoring you, really making a concerted effort, because these things don't happen, you know, it's not by magic. You're not going to get Black and brown journalists into senior positions just by chance. Like, a company has to decide that it's going to make an investment and it's going to make changes.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, I think, Jasmine, what you said about sponsorship is so key. And Barney, forgive me, I didn't mention reverse mentoring, or at least as a way to solve talent progression. I think it serves a purpose, definitely. And there have been some proven results, not for talent progression, but about the education, about bridging that gap and creating that proximity. And absolutely it takes a concerted and conscious effort to invest. And it will be time, money, and human resources into this investment in talent, and it needs to be conscious and it needs to be public as well. So I absolutely agree with what Jasmine was saying.
Sure. Thank you, Lucile. Well, folks, I want to give some time to our Q&A. So I'm just going to ask one final question, which is basically, if I could give you one wish in terms of just, you know, making some change happen in the next, you know, 6 months, you know, just one small act, or one small, if you could just make one small measure happen, what would that be? And I'll give Barney a chance to shoehorn all 7 of his into that. But yeah, I mean, if just thinking about how we make some of this stick, you know, because there is this overriding sense, isn't there, that there's an opportunity here, but if we don't take the opportunity, it may disappear and we may not see it again for some time. So if we want some kind of sustainable change to happen, and we had a magic wand just to make one thing happen, or see one thing addressed, what would that be? And I've deliberately kept my question very long so that you can think about what the answer is. But I am going to start with one of you, and it's going to be Jasmine. If you had one, if you could make one thing happen, just to make this a little bit more sustainable, what would it be?
I think it would be better mental health support for ethnic minority journalists. And I think I can't express enough the emotional and mental toll that takes from being the only one when you look in a newsroom and it's just a sea of white faces and you're the only one that looks like you. And even if everyone's nice and everything's cheery, like, you feel alienated. And I think if more organizations realize that and maybe put in the resources or did something to sort of address that would make a difference. And also addressing the fact that if you are female and ethnic minority, you're more likely to get, you know, abuse on social media when you write stories, but especially when you write stories about race. And I don't think senior editors realize that. Even things like keeping comments open on race stories, that opens you up to a wave of abuse. That's basic stuff that can be done. So yeah, I'd say looking out for reporters' mental health is a big one.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a great suggestion, Jasmine. Lucile, what would come to you if I can?
Yes, and it would be a proper planned and strategic succession planning. I know that in the newsroom, some roles are limited sometimes, especially at top level, there is one position. So how we look at 3 years ahead, 5 years ahead, who do we need to invest in and really train and really grow towards positions that will become available at some point, and really think very strategically about that succession planning across the newsroom.
Because, sorry, Lucile, I should have asked at the outset, but I mean, given that you've come in to the news business from other sectors, I mean, is the news organization a very different animal to you know, construction companies, to lawyers? I mean, you know, do news organizations, you know, do they have bigger gaps basically than many other companies have?
Well, listen, at the end of the day, we're the roles that I do is about supporting people, it's about asking questions, but most importantly, it's about listening. And when you take that into consideration, when you take people's lived experiences seriously and you use them to drive your strategy forward, then the what brings us together within industries is a lot stronger. That what is different.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Lucile. Nazia, I'm going to give you one wish. What would it be?
If it's only one, I think quite an easy thing would be to promote more journalists of colour and junior staff in the media industry into senior positions. I think that could fix a fair few issues that we have in the way that sometimes what Jasmine was talking about and what Barnie mentioned, in the way that journalists of colour are sometimes overlooked. If we had more people of colour in senior positions, that might help that to change. So yeah, so that would be my one wish if I only had one.
Okay, thank you, Nazia. And I'm going to tell Barney he only has one wish, but he might want to just make it a 7-point wish. Barney, but if you had to choose a couple of those, let's narrow you down to a couple of them.
Because I've already mentioned a few of them. But look, first of all, we need to look at the university courses. There isn't one single journalism course that does a compulsory module on race reporting or community reporting. So what are we teaching our kids who want to be journalists? Second of all, it's no use just looking at hiring junior people who are of colour. Look at all the levels and ask yourself a question. Why did people leave? Why did they go elsewhere? Where was your exit interview in terms of their leaving? How do you get them back? Because you've just wasted your time and effort. The BBC wasted 24 years of my experience because I left the organisation, and it's not using me at all. How stupid is that? Third, if you are going to hire people of colour, for goodness sake, people of colour, have some cojones. Start to mentor people. Don't be the only gay or Asian or black person in the village. Stop pulling the ladder up behind you. Fourth, as we've already said, give me permission to fail. Fifth, ask yourself a question. Why is it that black and Asian people and people of colour and women are actually in the same positions 15 years after starting the organisation? Why aren't you doing something about that? Why aren't you looking at the glass ceilings and the Berlin walls that you've built in the organisation? Sixth, teach them the rules of the game. It's as simple as pie, and anybody who's done the Harvard Business School will know that it's what pie means. Performance, impact, exposure. That exposure accounts for 60% of your success. 60%. Performing 100% of the time, it only accounts for 10% of your success. Being nice to people and creating a great impression is the other 30%. But it's that 60% exposure that people don't get. And then the last bit for me, we have to have data-driven, investigative, original journalism. Create teams that examine how things affect different groups, diverse groups. Because if you don't have the data, nobody's going to believe you. When Nazia goes to pitch, when Jasmine goes to pitch, the first question I as an editor is going to ask you is, where are your figures? And if you can't give me your figures, I'm not going to commission you. It really is that simple. Those are my 7 wishes.
Fantastic. Barney, thank you. Thank you to everyone on the panel for sharing just now. We've got 5 minutes to quickly go through the comments and the questions. And Nazia says, a lot to learn. One small but important point as an example, when the Indian variant surfaced for COVID-19, it was referred to as the Indian variant. This then taints the whole community, and it took some time before that was eventually changed to the Delta variant. Thank you, Nazar, for that point. Vicky, University of Reading has pledged to undertake action on racism after conducting a review on racial equality to ensure fairer treatment. Should universities be the catalyst for change? Well, Barney's just spoken to that point to a degree. But
I think Vicky was talking about it more holistically, though, and I think he makes a fantastic point.
Yeah, and be leading.
There aren't enough Black professors or Asian professors.
True, true.
Or senior leaders.
When it comes to Nassar says again, should journalists, why are journalists giving a voice to unacceptable racist behaviour? And he's referring there to footballers taking a knee and the booing of the footballers taking the knee. It feels like we're having to justify anti-racism, not challenging the awful behaviour by some parts of society. Surely there is a responsibility on journalists here. Panelists, I'm just going to leave these with you for you to decide which ones you want to pick up on. So, interrupt me if you can, if you want, or just come back to me in a minute. We talked about having more respect in the newsroom, didn't we? But Mukbul says, I hope that it's respect and not just a fear of offending. Great points to Charlotte, but does it impact and influence that people of colour are in public facing lower income jobs due to racial profiling? Is it better to be seen, Joan says, is it better to just be seen as a good reporter rather than being seen as a Black/ethnic minority reporter? Ooh, that's a big question.
Why can't you be both?
Why can't you be both?
Why can't you be both? Because if you're a great reporter, you're a great reporter. I've chosen to specialize in race and ethnicity because there's such a big gap. Nobody was doing it, so I did.
And actually, I've heard Gary Young talk about this, and say that no matter who you are, focus on reporting what is your passion, what you're interested in. And if that happens to be race, great. But if it happens to be sport or whatever, then do that to the best of your ability as well. So I think Barney, you're right there. We can do both. Yes.
I think for me, it's always been important to be seen as a good reporter. If I'm being completely honest, I mean, yeah, that was first and foremost. I didn't want to, even though I am a race correspondent now. I think that was really important to me, that I wasn't being sort of pigeonholed almost. So I think, yeah, a good reporter, and then asked for my opinion on race matters.
Yeah.
That way around. Yeah. So race issues.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Can I pick up on a point that I think Nazia made? Was it about why do we have to justify ourselves? I think you make a really great point, Nasser. I really do. So back in 2001, when the Northern riots happened, there was a guy called Nick Griffin, and he was the leader of the British National Party. And there was this big debate whether he should be allowed onto Question Time or not. And it was once he was on Question Time that you really found that he was an emperor with no clothes. He had nothing there. And unless we challenge it at every opportunity, unless we allow these people, especially the likes of Priti Patel, bless her, who lives in this rarefied atmosphere where she thinks that everybody, it's gesture politics, and yet she surrounds herself with 2 great union flags. If that's not gesture politics, I don't know what is. if we don't, at every single opportunity, give them a chance to hang themselves in their own rhetoric and challenge them at every point, we do what we did in the 1970s and 80s. We allow fungi to grow and we allow myths to be propagated. And that's why it's important, our role as journalists. We pick up the rock and see what crawls from underneath it. We hold a mirror up to society, but our job is to be that public voice, to make sure that we give that voice to those who can't. We get in front of Boris Johnson, we make sure that we ask the right questions. If we get in front of a racist, we challenge them. The only question that Nick Griffin could never answer was, is my daughter English? She was born in Leicester. Is she English? And after I'd asked him about 5 times, he came to the conclusion that she couldn't be English because she wasn't Indigenous white. And if you don't expose that, you're not doing your job.
Terrific. Thank you, Barney. Great points. Actually, Becky makes a great point here as well, because I guess we've been talking mostly about large news organizations. Becky's saying in small B2B publishers, there is usually no editorial framework for ensuring diverse coverage or even policies that cover racist or sexist behavior. So yeah, absolutely, Becky. Sorry, we have concentrated by and large on organizations that have policies and procedures and networks. Yeah, we need to recognize that in small organizations, often that support network simply doesn't exist. Let's see what else we got here. Somebody mentions a question for the panel, again from Becky. How do you feel about box ticking? How do we encourage journalist editors to consider expert opinions / sources from minority backgrounds? I'm not sure what type of box ticking Becky means there, but I know that some organizations, for instance, are encouraging reporters to keep stats on who they're interviewing and vox pops, and and just to do some data collection on that. So I don't know if we feel that's a helpful thing to do, and I don't know if that's what you mean, Becky, by that. How do we encourage journalists, editors to consider expert opinions, sources from minority backgrounds? Again, panel, just jump in if you want, if you've got a view on that.
I've talked too much, but there is what the BBC used to do is to have a grid of people that we interviewed, and that's how they found out that, and we had to fill it in. I, as a producer, had to fill it in, their ethnicity, their gender, and that's how they found out that we were missing certain sections. So sometimes tick boxes are really, really important because they do it. But more than that, I was talking to some Black and Asian MPs who say to me that as a Black or Asian MPs, they are rarely approached for any other opinion apart from race and what's happening. And yet some of these people have been CEOs. They are absolutely intelligent and can talk and have got a better grasp of British history than many of the white MPs that are there. And that's the shameful thing, is that we as journalists don't recognise the expertise that's already out there. And we need to do that. We really need to understand that.
Thank you, panel, for just being so generous with your time and your sharing of your insights and your experience. So thank you so much. To our audience, thank you very much for being with us today in this free event. I hope you found that useful.